So I got this question that says, how do I create a report that shows me all the checks that I've written from a specific account with the details that shows me what I spent that money for? Sometimes I try to create the report by clicking on the specific bank account in the balance sheet, but some of the checks have the word split under the expense or the account category. Can you please help me figure this out? Okay, so Raymond, this is a really interesting question. In order to answer it, I'm actually going to go back and teach a very fundamental topic that's kind of both a accounting fundamental and also a QuickBooks reporting fundamental. And that is the concept of source versus distribution. In QuickBooks, there's this concept that every transaction has a journal entry behind it. That journal entry is going to have one source line and at least one distribution line, but it could have multiple distribution lines. I'm going to go into a couple of examples, and you kind of have to memorize this and understand it in order to make sense of the reports that we're going to build. So think of the source line as the first line in the journal entry of every transaction, line 1, the top line, the header line. Also think of it as where the money is coming from to pay for that transaction. So if you're writing a check, the source line will be pointing to a bank account. If you're doing a credit card expense or a credit card charge, the source account will be pointing to the specific credit card that you used to make that charge. If you're writing an invoice, the source account would be accounts receivable because no money is being exchanged on the invoice. If you're creating a bill, a vendor bill that you're going to pay in the future, that source account will point to accounts payable. So it's sort of the source of the funding, money, or value that is going to be used in order to enter that transaction. Another way to think of the source line is the one that contains the payee info. So who are we dealing with in this transaction? What vendor are we paying? What customer is paying us? That's all going to be contained in the source line. Now, if you're using QuickBooks Online Plus or QuickBooks Online Advanced, the location would be information that will be mainly sourced from the source line. Now let's talk about distribution lines. So think of distribution lines as the second line or third, fourth, fifth, but it's at least the second line and every other line except for the first one that contains information about the transaction. Usually the destination or distribution lines will contain the actual category for that transaction. So it'll be the expense category, whatever it is that you're doing with that transaction, it would be the category that account will be classified as. Now, also, if you have a project or a job where you have an expense, for example, and you want to add that expense as a job costing, as an expense to the profit and loss of that job, that profit and loss information, the expense information of that project will only be contained in the destination lines, in the distribution lines. And also, if you're working with QuickBooks Online Plus and QuickBooks Online Advanced, classes usually go in the distribution lines. Let's do a couple more examples. The source line sometimes is referred to as the header line or as the summary line. And the reason why it's the summary line is because sometimes the information from the source line permeates and also gets recorded into the distribution lines as well. Again, we'll do an example of that. Just bear with me real quick. And then we have the distribution lines, which sometimes are called the detail, sometimes are called the split, sometimes are called destination. So these are the terms that you might see in different contexts depending on the version of QuickBooks that you're using and the type of report that you are creating. Now in this slide, you can see just a quick illustration. If you were to write a check, the information about the payee that you're paying and the bank account that you're paying from are examples of information that go in the source line or the header or the summary. Whereas the details of what you're buying with that check, the expense categories that you're recording the transaction for, and sometimes there'll just be one category. In this example, there's two. These would be the distribution lines, the detail lines, the split lines, the line items, or the destination. So that's typically the terms that are being used. Once you create a check, for example, or any transaction you can run a transaction journal so you can view the guts of the transaction, or you can view the debits and the credits of the transaction or the journal entry of the transaction. And you will notice every single time you pull a transaction journal, the very first line is going to be the source line, whereas the second line, the third line, and every other line except for the first will be the distribution line. So every transaction has a journal entry sort of behind the scenes, and the first line is the source. Second, third, fourth, fifth line would be the distribution. So now that we got the theory out of the way, let's pull up a check in QuickBooks Online and kind of view all these details in motion. So I'm going to click on my transaction history button on the top right of the screen, and then I'm going to click on any of the checks that I have created. So I'll just pick any of them, and the check will show up on the screen. So as we mentioned, inside of every transaction, there is a journal entry. So when I click on the More button on the bottom of the screen, and then I click on Transaction Journal, I can see essentially what would be that journal entry that gets recorded inside that transaction. So as you can tell, and I'll zoom this in real quick, as you can tell, the first line is containing the vendor information, or the payee information is containing the number, the check number. It contains the source account, the bank account where the money is coming from, which in this case happens to be a credit, and then the destination account, distribution account, split account, whatever you want to call it, which is advertising. That's the expense category, which in this case happens to be a debit. Every transaction will have a debit and a credit. Not all the sources are credits, and all the distributions are debits, depending on the context, depending on the transaction. So there's always a debit and a credit, and it could be one or the other depending on the type of transaction, but there's always also going to be a source and a destination. Now I'm going to go back and pull up a different check. I want to pull up a check that contains multiple lines of expenses. So I went ahead and pulled a check that contains 3 lines of expenses, just so we can see the journal entry is going to be a little bit different than the one that only has 1 line. You will also notice that there's 3 lines, and each of the lines contains, in this case, the same expense category, but we have different descriptions, different dollar amounts. 2 of them have job costing, and all of them have different classes. And this is why it is so important, so imperative to understand when you're pulling a report and you're going to filter the information, you need to know if you're filtering source information or if you're filtering distribution information. And this is where the concept of split comes in, where you get an error, which we're about to see very soon. So I'm going to click on More here, and then click on Transaction Journal again, so we can kind of see the journal entry that's behind the scenes for that transaction. And as you expected, you will notice that there's 4 lines in total. Line 1 is the source that contains the source account where the money is coming from, which happens to be a credit because this is a bank transaction. And then we have the 3 debits, which are the expense category subcontractor with different memos. And essentially, if I click on that gear menu here and click on Show More, I can also enable our classes and locations and customers. And we can also see that additional detail that is being recorded in the transaction itself. So just keep that in mind. Every transaction is going to contain a source and 1 destination or multiple destinations. So when we pull the report, we need to know what we are looking at. So I'm going to go back to the question that Raymond asked, which is, I try to run a report of all my checks, and then I get this word split on the expense category. Why is that happening? So for this check from Brittany, we're expecting the expense category to show split because there's more than 1 line, or more than 1 destination, more than 1 distribution line in the transaction. So I'm going to replicate the error that Raymond mentioned in the question. So I'm going to go into the balance sheet over here, and I'm going to click on our total bank account balance that's here. So it shows me a detailed report of all the transactions inside of all the bank accounts. I'm going to filter this just to 1 date so we don't see that many transactions. So I'll do this on the 14th, and then I'll click on Run Report. And now we're seeing a report that contains all the transactions are on that date. Now I'm going to collapse the left navigation bar so we can see a little bit more information. And I'm also going to filter this report so we're only seeing checks, right? So I'm going to ignore deposits and expenses and transfers, that sort of thing. So I'm going to click on customize on the top right, and then I'm going to click on filter. And then I'm going to go down to transaction type, click on the drop down and select check because I only want to see checks on this report. Then I'm going to click on run report, and now we're limited to just seeing checks. So this is the problem that Raymond had mentioned, which is, hey, look, some of the checks are showing my category. Look at the first two. They're showing subcontractor, dues and subscriptions, and notice that the next two are showing split. So the reason why that's happening is because inside those transactions, again, there's more than one line in the distribution line. I'm going to click on this one here that we haven't seen yet, but it's got the word split. So we can see the transaction, and exactly as we expected, there are two different transaction lines. So if you do this technique where you run the balance sheet and then you click on the total dollar value, filter the dates, and then select the transaction type check, you are going to get the list of all the checks that you wrote. But if you have any transactions that have more than one line, you're going to get this split issue there. Now, I want you to pay close attention to the accounts that are in the account column and the accounts that are in the split column. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a different report. I'm going to run a report that in its nature is a distribution report, not a source report. What we are seeing here essentially is a source type of report. It's a report that's focused on the source of the transaction. And because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to click on the gear menu, and I'm going to disable amount, and I'm going to disable balance. But in exchange, I'm going to click debit and credit, and I want to show this in debit and credit format. And I'm going to click out of it so the report refreshes and click on run report. So now we're seeing debit and credit format. Now notice that all my checks that are written in this case are grouped by the source account, which happens to be this Bank of America bank account and the Chase account. I can ungroup them if I want to, just by clicking on the top part where it says group by, change account to none, and then I basically degroup them, click on run, and I no longer will see them. Now, either way, I'm seeing all the checks that I wrote, I'm seeing those split lines, and then I'm seeing all the transactions as credit. The reason why all these transactions are credit is because I'm looking at it from a source perspective, and from my bank account's perspective, these are all credits. Credits is money coming out of the bank. Again, this is a source type of report, a report focused on the source. That's why all these transactions are credits. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the reports menu, and I'm going to create a different type of report. I'm going to create a report that's a distributions type of report, which is not a default report in QuickBooks. There's actually a trick to get to this report. So you kind of have to play with QuickBooks quite a bit to get to this point. And I've done it. So I'm going to tell you exactly how to create a distributions type of report, or a report focused on distribution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the profit and loss report. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the total expenses, not the net income, but I'm going to click on total expenses. So I'm going to just click on the total expense number in any profit and loss report. And this report automatically is now a source type of report. So now I'm going to run some filters so I only see those checks. I'm going to collapse that left navigation bar so I get a little bit more real estate. And now I'm going to click on customize on the top of the screen. I'm going to click on filter. I'm going to click on transaction type. And then I'm going to click on check. And I'm going to click on run. So at the same time, focus only on checks. I'm also going to change the date range here to match what we were looking for before, just one specific date. Click on run, and there we go. So now we have all of the checks here, but now they're grouped by the distribution account. These are now grouped by the expense category. So what I need to do is I'm going to click on group by, and then click on none because I want to ungroup them. I'm going to run report, and now I have the flat report that is similar to the other report that I pulled when I was pulling it from the balance sheet. However, I'm going to add a couple of steps here. I'm also going to click on the gear menu and do the same thing. I'm going to get rid of amount and balance and turn on debit and credit. Just the accountant inside of me can't help it. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and see how these reports, again, the transactions are debit and credit, but now these are all debits. The reason for that is because this is a distributions account. And if you notice under the account column, now this is not focused on the bank account where the money is coming from. This is focused on the expense category or the distribution line that was in each transaction. You will also notice that checks that contain multiple lines are shown sort of as repeats. So these are not repeats. This is just the only way that QuickBooks can figure out how to show you all the information in one report. It needs to show it as different lines. So they're not different transactions. Brittany Hughes is a single check, but by looking at the check number repeating, that's how I know that that's a single transaction that is hitting multiple categories. I'm also going to click on the gear menu here, and then I'm going to turn on the customer tab, locations, and class. I'm going to go ahead and turn off adjustment because I don't need that. I'm going to turn off transaction type and get just a little bit more relevant information. So now I'm looking at a report where I'm seeing the date, number, the payee, I'm seeing the memo, I'm seeing the expense category under account. Notice that now the source account is under split. So in this case, because this report is sort of inverse of how QuickBooks runs reports by default, it flipped the concepts. So in this specific case, it's using the word split because of the perspective of the report. Now, generally, the split actually is advertising, dues, materials. That's generally the split. And then Chase and Bank of America would be the source account. But because this report is inverse, it's actually the opposite of how QuickBooks was designed to work, is showing it in that inverse order. And then we can see here on the right-hand side that we have our customer and our location because we turned on those fields. So we can resort any of these columns if we want to. If we want to see class first, and then we want to see maybe the expense account second, and then we want to see the debit and the credit. Of course, you would choose whatever you want for that order depending on how that's relevant to you. But what I'm trying to show you is you can show a list of all your checks with all the details. They're going to show or look like it's multiple transactions, but this is the way QuickBooks can show you the details without showing you that pesky split line that's in there. Now I'm going to show you one more thing because for some people that might be the preferred choice depending on what you're trying to achieve. There's a different report, and I'm going to go into the reports menu and I'm going to search it. It's called, I'm going to just type the word splits. It's called transaction list with splits. This is not my favorite go-to report, but in certain scenarios, this could be useful. So this type of report shows the source of the transaction. Then it shows all the splits right under it, but it doesn't show it as multiple lines the way the other report did it. So I'm going to come in here and do the 14th because that's what we're looking at. So just 1 day worth of transactions. And then I'm going to go click on Run Report. I'm going to go to Customize on the top right, go to Filter, Transaction Type again, and only show checks. And then click on Run Report. So now we're seeing only the checks. And I'm also going to remove the grouping. I'm going to click on None and then click on Run Report. And then we essentially have the same information, but now it's organized in a way to let you know that you have one source line, and then we have just a bunch of white space. And then as you look towards the right-hand side, each of these lines are represented there. So the transaction list with splits kind of makes that separation between the transactions, and it shows the splits in those blank lines per se. So behind the scenes, there are lines. If this was a spreadsheet, those would be lines, but in this case, they're hidden lines because the way the report is set up is so there's a huge separation between them. So you can compare something like this that I just created that has every line pretty much filled out, looks a little bit more like a spreadsheet, which this is the one that my suggestion on how to do it. And then we have the splits as the second option. So anyway, Raymond, thank you for the question. There's a lot of details and moving parts, and I kind of wanted to go pretty deep into this whole concept of source and destination, and hopefully that little piece of insight makes it easier for you to create custom reports in the future. Always remember, when you're going to create a custom report and you're going to run filters, you need to know, is the data that I'm looking at part of the source or is it part of the distributions? That little trick will help you create custom reports every time. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Make sure you hit like, add some comments below. Did I miss something? What other reports or what other QuickBooks videos on reports or any other topic would you like to see? Let me know in the comments. Thank you.